We continue on now with part 2 of Historical Man. So again, our goal is to give our hearts to Christ, to trust in Him, form a loving relationship with Him, so that we can align our ethos, our subjective moral values, with His ethics. Christopher West says, passing over from the commandment of the old law to the new ethos of the gospel demands a radical paradigm shift of God's people. We are justified by God's grace as a gift through the redemption which is in Christ Jesus, not by following the rules. So we can follow God's rules, His laws externally, but Jesus wants our hearts. And at least in my experience, I've learned that by following all the rules externally, you can look really good on the outside. You can live a pretty good life, morally speaking, but you will still have a raging interior battle which will wear you down over time. The true path to holiness is by giving your heart, this deep, deep, deep well of who you are, to God. Allow Him to heal and renew you and redeem you so that you desire to follow His commandments. That desire comes from within, from your ethos. St. Augustine says, the law was given that grace might be sought, and grace was given that the law might be fulfilled. So it is through grace, which is that help from God, that this process occurs. The more we align our hearts and our ethos to God's ethics, the more we are freed from the law. Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, think not that I have come to abolish the law and the prophets. I have come not to abolish them, but to fulfill them. If you were led by the Spirit, you are not under the law, Paul says in Galatians. Laws do not change our hearts. Only Christ can do that. He gives us the commandments to reveal the areas of our hearts which need to change, and then gives us the grace to transform and redeem our hearts so that we no longer desire to break the commandments. So if you look over the course of your life, you look at the church teachings, the scriptural teachings that you struggle with the most, that you really resent, that you have a battle interiorly to try and follow those commandments and the will of God in those areas. That's the purpose of the law, to reveal to you what needs to be transformed. And then through God's grace, your heart can be transformed if you're willing to open it up so that you no longer desire to break those commandments. So I don't know about you, but I have no desire to murder another human person. That is not a law that I have a problem with. I'm sure there's people in the world that need that law. But naturally speaking, within myself, I have no desire. My ethos is aligned with God's ethics in that particular area. However, there are other areas that I struggle with. I might even believe everything that the church teaches, but following it with my whole heart is a struggle. And so on the path of holiness, I have to continually surrender my desires and my heart until I get to the point where those laws or rules, or however you want to word them, are no longer an issue for me to follow. St. Augustine says that at that point, we're free from the law because we love God and then we can really do whatever we want because we're going to do God's will. So again, this is Satan's fundamental lie for every sin. Grasp at what you want. God does not love you. He does not have any gift in store for you. He does not want your good. So you have to go out and get it yourself by going around God, by ignoring God, by doing it on your own. Whereas the true plan for us is becoming in communion with God, aligning ourselves with Him and His plan for us and His will, and then we'll be truly free to do whatever we want. It's the difference between this true freedom and Satan's promise of freedom, which is really false freedom. False freedom is doing whatever you want without regard to God. True freedom is doing God's will, and then you'll be free to do what you want within God's plan for you. Now, throughout human history, there have been various heresies which have contradicted the theology of the body. Manichaeism is one of these heresies. It's started in about the 3rd century, but still exists within Christian thoughts today, and it's popped its head up in various other ways and names throughout human history in the last 1700 years. But essentially, Manichaeism sees the source of evil in the body. So another way of putting it is spirit good, soul good, body bad. And in the 3rd century, the Manichaeists would grossly torture and mortify their flesh. And this occurred in the Middle Ages. There were actually, unfortunately, some notable Christians throughout the Middle Ages who mistakenly did this until they were corrected by the church. Anyone who intentionally harms their body or intentionally looks down upon their flesh as evil has fallen prey to this heresy, because our bodies are beautiful and integrated with our souls and are a reflection of God's goodness and love. That is the true Christian teaching. Or why would Christ become incarnate in a human person, in a human body? Now, if you have this understanding that the church negates the value of sex, sex is dirty, sex is bad. The Puritans were notorious from this. They bought into this Manichaeist heresy. Or you just kind of tolerate it because of the necessity of procreation. These are Manichaean attitudes. Now, unfortunately, in the Victorian era, which derived the attitudes towards sex in the body were derived from the Puritans and that whole faith base, there were a lot of people, even within the Catholic Church in the early mid-20th century, that viewed sex and the body in this way. Sex is dirty. Sex is bad. The soul is good. And so we have still some lingering ideas of this in our Catholic Church today, in our Catholic culture today. I shouldn't say church, our Catholic culture today. We must root this out and speak the truth of the theology of the body to anyone who believes this. Now, within the church and within Christianity, we have masters of suspicion who believe that concupiscence defined man. The Pharisees are a perfect example of this. Followed all the rules externally, looked really good on the outside, but interiorly never believed in the fullness of redemption. The belief here is that we cannot overcome concupiscence. We're bound by it until death. And therefore do not really fully believe or know the transforming power of the gospel. I would venture to say that there are people within the Catholic Church, even some, unfortunately, church leaders and theologians who have given themselves over to this idea that life is just sin management, just looking good, doing the best we can, doing good charitable acts, helping others, going to confession, but kind of just drifting through life the best we can without really going deep and changing our hearts. Now, we've been talking about redemption of the heart, changing our hearts, trusting in God through His grace to transform us in our ethos. So I'm going to introduce another Greek word here, which is eros. Eros is one of the Greek words for love, and specifically for our passions and desires. Now, if you've studied Christian theology, you've probably heard of agape love, which is godly love. And eros is another one of the words the Greeks used for love. We get our modern English word erotic from this Greek root. Now, again, when we think of erotic, we do not typically think of purity of heart and purity of desire. We typically think of pornography, strip clubs, prostitution, those kind of things. Now, the Greeks had another word for that type of lustful activity, which was porneos, which is where we get pornography from. So they distinguished the two. Eros, or erotic, in the Greek love language did not necessarily mean porneos, or erotic, perverted pornography type of love, which was dominated by lust. And John Paul II seizes this idea in the Theology of the Body and talks about the teachings of Christ and how they relate to eros and erotic love. And he says, do the teachings of Christ condemn the erotic? He says, no. Eros, at its deepest level, is that inner power that attracts man to the true, the good, and the beautiful. We're created in the image and likeness of God. We're created to be attracted to God. Maybe you've heard that we have like a God-shaped hole. We're created to worship God, and only God will satisfy that desire. And that desire, that innermost power, John Paul II uses the word eros, erotic love. So this is, again, unwrapping and unraveling the twisted nature of kind of our worldly understanding of love, which Satan has clumped together, eros and porneos, into one thing so that we cannot clearly see this. So within the one flesh union of the spouses, it is possible to have a pure erotic love. John Paul II actually goes into some pretty intense detail for a celibate pope and talks about how there should be a mutuality there of orgasm between the spouses, that the man should be aware of his wife and her needs in the sense of reaching climax. And so the question here, can the spouses just abandon themselves to their desires? Okay. So in one sense, no, the spouses should not just abandon themselves to lust, which is using each other for pleasure. But there is an invitation to a deeper and richer spontaneity, which is to infuse their erotic love with the fire of godly love. And and sort of go next level, because that is the deep longing desire for the true, the good, and the beautiful. And so this look back to where Adam and Eve in the purity of the garden, where they had loving relations with each other, sexual relations in a pure, holy way. That does not mean that it wasn't pleasurable. That does not mean that it wasn't erotic. So we have to be careful here that to not fall into the Manichaean understanding of sex. Basically, which would say that if you want to have holy sex, you can't have good sex. John Paul II would say that is false. So again, while the spouses should not abandon themselves to lust, to using each other for pleasure, marriage is not a license for lust. It is a calling to go deeper into intimacy between the spouses, to connect at all levels, and in the one flesh union of the spouses, to infuse eros with godly love, with agape, and to take it to the next level of erotic love. And so, when we look at our desires, this taking everything to the next level requires us, again, interiorly in ourselves to redeem our own desires. You can't give what you don't have. If you're married with the spouses and you're trying to take your love to the next level and be holy and pure, if you don't have your own interior life sorted out, it's going to be impossible. It's not going to happen. So throughout human history, when the human heart with its desires, with our desires, have surveyed the world, we typically have two extreme reactions. The first reaction is that of sexual repression, and this goes again back to kind of this Manichaeist understanding. Sex, bad. Body, bad. And if that's true, and then you have these desires compelling you toward the erotic, the only solution then would be to repress them. Because if the body's bad and the sex is bad, then the desires have to be bad. And so we then experience this struggle interiorly where we're trying to put a lid on our desires. But our desires are good in as much as they are aligned to the good, the true, and the beautiful. And so deep down, God gave us these desires, even the desire for pleasure, to point us to Him. So when we repress these desires, we end up in a very stoic state. And this is Christopher West's language. We end up in a very rigid and, I would even say, oppressed version of our faith. Maybe you've experienced this in your own life. Maybe you've experienced this with other figures in the church. I certainly have, and I've experienced it in my own life, to where we run into people that are so repressed with their desires that the only way that they can convey their faith is by exerting control on other people. Everything in the church has to be perfect. The flowers have to be perfect. The music has to be perfect. And so because they have this interior battle and they barely have control of their own desires, they have to control everything. That's one way it manifests itself. And so this is a very big problem within the church, this sort of repressive way of handling our desires. The other extreme, of course, is to indulge our desires, to become an addict. Sort of when you're boiling water for pasta and you put that lid on the water and you have all this boiling water, and then it comes up and then it overflows and starts spitting onto your stove. Eventually, when you put the lid on your desires, a lot of times they're going to boil up and overflow. And so many people just choose to give up and indulge their pleasure. We saw this in the 1960s with the sexual revolution. The puritanical Victorian background of the 17th, 18th, 19th century exploded in the 50s and 60s. And people just trashed cultural norms. Unto this day, the last 70 years or so, have just trashed cultural norms in regards to human sexuality. So there is a pendulum swing a lot of times between the two, because if you're a good Christian and you get into indulging your desires, you feel guilt. And so then maybe you swing back to repression. But then the desires are still there and you don't know what to do with them. So then the pot overboils again and you're back to indulgence. Now, if these are the only two choices, starvation or eating from the dumpster, as Christopher West would say, then most people would eat from the dumpster. They wouldn't starve themselves to death. But there is a third option, which is eating from the banquet that God provides for us, trusting in Him and going through the process of redemption of the heart, sexual redemption. We see here the statue of the ecstasy of St. Teresa. This statue is a beautiful image of erotic love of a saint for God. Now, those in the church who have a problem, the masters of suspicion, with this idea of erotic love for God, have a problem with this image. It is possible for us to have erotic love for God. It is simply orienting our deepest desires of eros toward agape. That is only possible through God's grace and for our desires to be redeemed. And this is possible through the virtue of chastity. The virtue of chastity is the successful integration of your sexuality within yourself. And with God, all things are possible. We can overcome concupiscence and achieve that integration. We have to achieve it in order to be one with Him in heaven. John Paul II says in Theology of the Body 48:1, it is necessary continually to rediscover the spousal meaning of the body and the true dignity of the gift in what is erotic. This, the task of the human spirit. If one does not assume the task, the very attraction of the senses and the passion of the body can stop at mere concupiscence, deprived of all ethical value. If man stops here, he does not experience that fullness of eros, which implies the upward impulse of the human spirit toward what is true, good, and beautiful, so that what is erotic also becomes true, good, and beautiful. Wow. God has so much to give us. He has so much of an amazing gift for us. Don't settle. Don't sell ourselves short of this beautiful gift. Don't just settle for sin management in our life of faith. Go for the fullness of the gift. Go for the gusto. That is what the message of the theology of the body truly is. So the ethos of sexual redemption is more precisely the ethos of the redemption of the body. And for JP2, the redemption of the body is not one aspect of redemption, but speaks of the reality of redemption in its entirety. So when we look at redemption, and we've talked about this, you've heard about this probably throughout your life, it's not just a soulful redemption, it's not just a spiritual thing, it is also redemption of our bodies and our very emotions, our desires, everything that was within us as a human person. Now, of course, we're in the process of this. Very few people, maybe the greatest saints, get really close to that by the end of our life, but we all are called to go along in this process and get as close as possible, because we battle with concupiscence daily, but the power of redemption is far greater than we can imagine. So keep up the good fight. Continue to open your hearts to Christ. Do not settle for anything less than the gift he's given you.